Good day. Today I will be presenting to you how to write your results and discussion, as well as the summary of findings, conclusion, and recommendation chapters. So, the chapters in a thesis or full manuscript is based on the institutional format. So in the case of our school, we use the IMRAD format where we combine the introduction chapter as well as the review of related lit. So that becomes chapter 1. Unlike in other schools, they have a review of literature as a separate chapter. And for that reason, chapter 3 becomes results and discussion, whereas summary conclusion and recommendation chapter becomes the chapter 4. So it's only a practice here in the Philippines where in most institutions we have 5 chapters. However, in other countries, they actually have 6 chapters because they allot 1 chapter just for the implication. So, in writing results and discussion, we observe these 3 sections. So, first of all is overview. Then we have the results. And then finally, we have the discussion. So let me remind you that when you prepare your journal ready article, the results and discussion are written together. So which means the discussion follows right after the narrative of the results. However, in the case of a thesis or the full manuscript, the discussion section is separate from the results. Now, in writing the overview, you have to tell the reader again the statement of the problem, the research objectives, and methods. So this is just a summary, as brief as you can, so that your readers would be guided of the results to be presented. And the statement of the problem is your research aim, whereas the research objectives are the answers to the statement of the problem or the research aim. Your methods are aligned depending on the number of your research objectives. And for that reason, the number of sections presented in the result section is also dependent on the number of the research objectives. So in writing the results section, we have to present logically according to research objectives. We all know that your research objectives are logically arranged. And for that reason, we cannot find there a bulleted objectives, but rather these are enumerated. That one must be done first prior to the conduct of the second the research objective. The subsection should be equal to the number of the research objectives. So, for instance, if you have 3 research objectives, then you also have 3 subsections under your result section. These subsections must be labeled according to the research objective. However, you don't have to rewrite your research objectives as your subsection. For instance, if your first research objective is to measure the pH of something like that, then the subsection can be written as pH measurements. Anyway, the research objectives are already provided in the overview. So that is why if one has to read your work, the person or the reader does not have to go back to chapter 1 to check your research aim as well as your research objectives. By simply checking the overview, one can tell what is your research aim, your statement of the problem, what are your research objectives, and what methods did you employ to answer your research objectives, rather than you let your reader to check your previous chapters. And why do we have an overview and how important an overview is? Again, aside from the basis in writing the results section, it is more of being considerate to your reader, because you always have to remember the principle that we have to write with the readers in mind. Now, for number 3, the narratives are claims, while tables and or figures serve as warrant. Warrants, by the way, are data that you have generated. So that is why when you have pH measurement, you don't present the table or tabulated data and the figures, then explain to the reader, but rather explain first to the reader and then provide the table and the figures. If the result is only one or uniform, then you don't have to present them in table or in figure. Textual presentation is all right. Then you also have to report other important findings. If ever you use this scheme of presenting your result, there might be other results that you need to present to the readers. And then you have to point the reader to the data shown in figures and or the tables. You don't let your readers interpret the figures or the table. You have to direct them. You have to lead them. Then, it is also worth noting that the the control is presented so that they can interpret better your figures or table, because you reminded them that these are the things you control, rather than for them to check again in your methods section. The interpretation of the data is or is your responsibility as the author. In fact, by not interpreting the data to the reader, you allow the reader to interpret the data for you. The reader can only be critical to the result. However, it is your responsibility to tell them what are these numbers in your data, in your table rather, and what do these figures represent, and what do they imply. Because a value is just a value, not until you explain to them what's the meaning of these values. Of course, it would be best if there are statistical information with the data, and you place results that answer the question of the paper at the beginning of the results section. So you always have to tell them what is the result first before you go to other details. Then you organize the result section chronologically or from the most to least important. So there are other ways to present the subsections of the result section. The common one is by answering the research objective. However, another way to present that would be the most to least important, as long as you cover all other data and the research objectives. Emphasize and signal your results, subordinate secondary information. So aside from control as that other information, there might be some information that you would like to tell them to to enlighten the reader of the result. And then normally we use things like it is clearly shown in the table, or it is obvious from the result. We avoid the use of these words because the the result may not be obvious to the reader. It might not be clear. So you don't tell them that it is clear. You write so that it would be obvious and clear to the reader. You use past tense for your result, but present tense for the descriptive papers. Now, for additional principles, omit peripheral information and irrelevant general statements. So if it's not corroborated by any other result, then, data, then please omit them. Avoid experimental details because the details of the experiment should be in the method section. Even those things that you have changed, you have to reflect that in your method section. So writing results and discussion must be reflective of the changes or the modifications during the conduct of the experiment. But these are not written in the result section, but this is reflected in the method section. You avoid general conclusions, speculations, or comparisons with other studies. Again, the exception to this is when you write results and discussion section in a journal ready article because you have to compare your result with the result of other related studies. Now, the structure would be the following. You state and interpret your key findings. This is by using your key findings, interpretation, and your discussion. So you have to provide the answer to the research question. Your answer to the research question, which is the research aim, would be your research objectives. So you summarize and generalize towards the end. And then you also have to keep in mind who your potential readers will be. In our case, we have the scientific community. And then you organize the discussion in a pyramid structure. The pyramid structure can be from the most essential to the least essential information, or it could be from the enumeration of the research objectives to answer the research aim. So that is why this is the detail of the so-called pyramid structure. In the first paragraph, you have to provide your interpretation and answer based on key findings. And then, what is your supporting evidence? Normally, the supporting evidence would be the table or the figure. So it's really important that you interpret the table and the figure first to your reader. So the narrative comes first. This explains it. And then the middle paragraph would be comparison or contrast to previous studies. You mention what other studies results are with regards to your result. And then the limitations of your study can be presented for each research objective. However, you may sum them up towards the end as one different or as a separate paragraph of the limitations of the study. Then you also tell them what are the unexpected findings and what is the explanation or your discussion with regards to any existing hypothesis or models. And finally, you come up with your summary or the significance or implication. Again, you can present your discussion by research objectives, or you just have to discuss having the first and the middle paragraphs, then come up with a separate paragraph for all the limitations, and then the summary or the significance or the implication of your study. So how do we do that in our study? After discussing all your research objectives, you have to provide what are the limitations, and then finally you go back to your research aim. So knowing that you already have this result, you again go back to what you problematize and what do your data tell us about the the implication of your study, because you post a question that should have pushed the frontier of an understanding in that particular field. Therefore, you tell now your reader what could this data mean. Now, what are the common errors? The common errors are, first, the writing of limitation and delimitation. So when we speak of delimitation, delimitation is what you have written in chapter 1. There is already a disclosure of what were the information or the research design that is not covered by your research objectives. So that's the meaning of delimitation. So delimitation is more of disclosure. However, when we speak of limitation, these are aspects of your study that during the conduct of the data gathering, you did not anticipate them, that it could have been part of the design. So limitation is humbling down, and you do not repeat all these factors or variables in your limitation. And limitation is just a subsection of your results and discussion. Delimitation is found as a section of your chapter 1. So there is actually a difference between limitation and delimitation. Again, you do not repeat your delimitation in the limitation. And then, limitation is the basis by which you make a recommendation to your readers. So the details of the enumerated limitation are expounded in the next chapter under the recommendation section. Now, the closing or the discussion section should be a summary or the generalization with respect to the research aim or the implication of your result to the understanding of the topic of investigation. Now, chapter 5 has 3 sections. You have the summary of findings, conclusion, and recommendation. Now, but why do we have an overview? An overview is provided, which is actually a repetition again of your research aim, your research objectives, and probably you don't have to include the methods here. It's just that the summary of findings would be the enumeration of all the answers to the research objectives. So it would be better if summary of findings are enumerated here. Conclusion is the answer to the research aim or the statement of the problem. So you just have to be direct, but it doesn't mean that you have to repeat your narrative in chapter 4. You already have to synthesize here. How are you going to write your conclusion? Your recommendation is how you expound your limitation. It could be a part of the narrative of the research objective being discussed, or it could be a separate paragraph in your the discussion section. All right. And then take note that chapters involving results and the discussion is more of the thoughts of the writer. Whereas in chapter 1, as well as chapter 2, you really have to consider checking the different resources. Whereas in the case of the discussion, you are allowed already to present your own understanding based on the result of the study when you make your summary and generalization. However, one has to be careful when coming up with a summary or generalization without the data to support the claims in the summary and the generalization. So, take note that writing results of the discussion allows the investigator to present their thoughts about the result. And with that, happy writing, and may we have a better results and discussion, as well as presentation of summary of findings, conclusion, and recommendation chapters.